I grew up in a quiet little town nestled along the coast, where life moved at a steady, predictable pace. My family had been part of the fabric of the community for generations, with my dad running a well-known insurance firm. Our last name was practically synonymous with reliability. My early years were shaped by the routines of small-town living, where I found comfort in numbers and a fascination with how money worked. By the time I finished my degree in finance, I was set on following in my dad's footsteps, though I aimed to bring my own flavor to the business. I wanted to help people grow their wealth steadily, leaning heavily on caution rather than risk. Starting my own financial practice wasn't a walk in the park, especially in a place where everyone already knew me as JD, the son of Joe Dalton, the insurance guy. But I put in the work, building on the rock-solid reputation my dad had built. Eventually, I carved out my niche, earning the trust of clients who appreciated my conservative approach to handling their money. However, as time went on, it became clear that the town was too small to contain my ambitions. I needed to branch out. So, I started splitting my time between our town and a bigger city nearby, hoping to grow my client base and secure my future. This weekend, it was our turn to host the gathering. About every month or so, our tight-knit group of 6, 3 couples, would get together, usually at one of our homes. The usual crowd included Sarah, a close friend of my wife, Amy, and her husband, Kyle, along with our neighbors, Jill and Mark. Sometimes others would join in, but this was the core group. We were all in our late 20s, none of us with kids. Sarah and Kyle had decided against having any, and while Mark had 2 from a previous marriage, they lived with his ex-wife, though he was eager to gain custody. These get-togethers always involved food, drinks, and some kind of theme. Sometimes we played games like Trivial Pursuit, cards, or watched a game on TV. When we gathered at Mark's house, we'd swim in his pool if the weather was nice. The girls, especially Sarah and Amy, loved organizing these parties, making sure we had enough people on a particular date. Amy, my wife, is a lively woman with wavy light brown hair and a curvy figure. She's a bit of a flirt, which can get on my nerves sometimes, but as far as I know, she's never crossed any lines. I grew up in a small town on the East Coast where my family still lives. I graduated from the State University with a degree in finance and passed the exams to become a certified financial planner. I'm naturally introverted, but I'm passionate about studying money markets, statistics, and the history of our economic system. My dad ran an insurance business in our town, and his honest reputation gave me credibility in the local financial scene. I was named after him. He was Joseph Dalton, and I was called JDI, rented an office in his building, and worked hard to schedule meetings with folks, explaining my strategy for their money. "I want your money to grow steadily but safely," I'd tell them. I was affiliated with a national company which provided a lot of financial data, but I also spent hours doing my own research, which I enjoyed immensely. My first year was moderately successful. My clients saw solid returns, and their portfolios outperformed the market. I liked sharing office space with my dad, and many of his longtime clients became mine as well. I made it a point to meet with my clients regularly to get to know them better and offer personalized service. They appreciated the contact. However, as I entered my second year, it became evident that there wasn't enough business in our town to sustain my financial goals. As someone well-versed in economics, I realized I couldn't meet my ambitions by relying solely on local clients. The weather was perfect for our party, so we decided to eat outside on our spacious deck, which had a barbecue and an outdoor kitchen area. "What theme should we go with tonight?" I asked Amy. "Let's play a game," she suggested. "We'll do something fun that everyone will enjoy. Doesn't that sound good, JD?" she said with enthusiasm. There was always a bit of competition over who could throw the most enjoyable party. I mostly looked forward to the good company, food and drinks. I'll admit I'm quite fond of my wine, and there have been times when I've had one glass too many. "What game?" I asked. "Don't worry, JD, I'll figure it out. You just get the barbecue going," she replied. That was fine by me. As I got things set up, my mind wandered to the group coming over tonight. First, there's Sarah and Kyle. Sarah and Amy have been friends since high school. Sarah's a bit on the heavy side, but it suits her. Kyle is a diesel mechanic who works at a big shop in the city. He's a laid-back guy who doesn't seem to mind when Sarah flirts or shows off a bit. He's a big guy, probably around 6'3". I like him well enough, but I doubt we'd be friends if not for the connection between Amy and Sarah. Jill and Mark are our neighbors, though I can't quite remember how we became so close to them. Jill's face is plain, but she has a great figure. Not the soft curves of Amy, but more of a toned leanness. She's smart, and out of the whole group, she's the one I have the most in common with. Mark is a golfer, lean, and about 5'9". There's an arrogance to him that initially put me off, but over time I've come to like the guy. I'm not sure I trust him completely, but he's clever, funny, and fun at these parties. Just then, the doorbell rang. The guests had started to arrive. I had recently decided to move my financial planning practice to the city while keeping my office in the coastal town. The drive between the two locations was about 2.5 hours. My plan was to spend 1 week each month in the town, staying with my parents and meeting with clients and potential clients. So far, the arrangement was working out well. In the city, I shared an apartment with Julian Lee, a college friend who worked in IT at a large bank. Julian was a creative type, so I was surprised he chose that career path. We had a 2-bedroom apartment in the trendy Maplewood district near downtown. I could walk to my office, and there were plenty of restaurants, bars, and shops all within a short stroll. The area was definitely young, vibrant, and trendy. One of those bars is where I first met Amy. She worked at Luceros, a popular restaurant and bar about 2 blocks from my apartment. I think it was the 3rd time Julian and I went there when I struck up a conversation with her. To me, Amy looked like she had stepped right out of a magazine, gorgeous and curvy. She was behind the bar, and we got to talking. She asked me all kinds of questions about my life, my career goals, and more. Honestly, I was surprised she was so interested in me. She was stunning, and I was just a regular-looking financial planner. Back in high school, I had a steady girlfriend, Megan Barnes. Megan was attractive, smart, and fun to be around. We tried to make it work through college, but it was too difficult with the distance. I dated a bit during college, but never had a serious relationship during those 4 years. That night, as we left the bar, I almost asked Amy out. I even got the sense she wanted me to, but I hesitated, worried she might turn me down, and we'd have to find a new hangout. "Man, she's hot," Julian said. "She's into you. You need to ask her out." "You think so?" I replied. "You better do it quick or someone else will beat you to it," he urged. The next night, I went to Luceros by myself and asked Amy out for Sunday night, and that's how we started dating. I was a little intimidated. I'd never been with someone this attractive before, but she gave me all the right signals that she was into me. It wasn't long before she showed me what I considered the ultimate sign, her complete, uninhibited self. Amy was unlike anyone I'd ever been with. Up until then, I'd had a few sexual partners, including my high school girlfriend Megan. I had explored a bit sexually, but I was still a novice. Amy, on the other hand, had a wealth of experience. We did everything, and she was entirely uninhibited, teaching me things and doing things I never even imagined. She wasn't overweight, but had soft curves that made her all the more feminine. Sometimes I wondered how she learned all these things. Just how experienced was she? I knew the answer, very experienced. But I avoided the topic of her sexual history, afraid it would be too painful. Any unease I felt was far outweighed by the satisfaction I got from being with her. Now, everyone was sitting out on our back deck. We had finished dinner, and we were all about 2 drinks into the evening. I think I was on my 3rd glass of red wine. I had a long conversation with Kyle about his hopes of being promoted to manager at the diesel shop where he worked. He mentioned that the owner was very religious and asked if I thought attending the same church might help his chances. I told him that unless he was sincere about the religion, it might come off as fake. He said he'd have to think about it. As we sat talking, Sarah suddenly asked, "So, Amy, what's the plan for tonight?" Okay, everyone, Amy began. Keep an open mind and remember, it's all in good fun. We're going to play Truth or Dare. I thought, oh no, but Kyle, Sarah, and Mark clapped and cheered, clearly on board. I looked at Amy and she smiled at me before quickly glancing at Sarah, Kyle, and Mark, who were grinning. Jill had a half smile and was the only one, besides me, who didn't seem particularly enthusiastic. The game started off fairly tame, with a bit of innuendo here and there, nothing too risky. Questions like, who was your celebrity crush? Or, how old were you when you lost your virginity? Then it was Mark's turn to ask, and he chose Amy. She chose Dare. Amy, I dare you to take off either your shorts or your top, Mark challenged. Wait a minute, I said, but Amy cut me off. It's okay. I've got underwear on. It's like a swimsuit, she said. Amy loved being the center of attention, and there had been times when her behavior came close to crossing the line. While I loved the confident sexuality she shared with me, I definitely didn't want others to experience that same closeness with her. Amy quickly whipped off her top, standing there in her lacy white bra. She stood proudly as Mark and Kyle whistled. Sarah giggled, "You go, girl!" Amy was soaking up the attention. I was a little annoyed, but I kept my thoughts to myself. The game continued with nothing too extreme until Sarah was dared to flash. Unlike me, her husband Kyle encouraged her. She flashed them, and they were definitely big. Not my taste, but big. Everybody was laughing except for Jill and me. "One more round and then we're done with this game," I said. There were a few laughs and some protests, but I was worried we might cross a line. It was Amy's turn, and she asked Mark, "Okay, Dare." "Flash your goods for 10 seconds, she challenged. "Don't you dare," Jill replied immediately. But Mark stood up, unbuttoned and unzipped, then dropped his shorts and boxers. Both Amy and Sarah were staring while I was shocked, and Kyle was laughing. Mark even did a little gyration, like a male dancer. When I looked at Amy, she was just staring at him. At that point, Jill said, "I'm leaving," looking more than a little upset. She told Mark he could either get dressed and get in the car or he could walk home. Everyone left shortly after, officially ending the party. As we were cleaning up, Amy was unusually quiet. After we finished tidying up, I said, "That went a little too far, don't you think?" "Oh, it was just for fun. Don't be such a stick in the mud," she replied, trying to make light of it. "Amy, people were undressed, or nearly undressed, right here, and you were one of them," I said. I shot back, "Unclothed?" She grinned and said, "I'll show you unclothed," and began to strip right there. I was quickly and thoroughly distracted, but it didn't erase the nagging feeling I had about how the party had unfolded. I was determined to have a serious talk with Amy about what happened. I've never been the kind of guy who gets a kick out of his wife showing herself off around other men. That night, I fell asleep feeling both satisfied and troubled. On Sunday morning, I was up first and went for my usual run. As I ran, the solitude gave me time to think and plan the conversation I was going to have with Amy. I intended to make it clear that while I enjoy a good time as much as anyone, our bodies were a promise we made to each other on our wedding day, and I wasn't going to compromise on that. When I got home, I could hear Amy on the phone. She must have heard me come in because the laughing stopped and her voice dropped. Just before she noticed me, I thought I heard her say something about a package. "Who was that?" I asked. "Oh, just Sarah," she giggled. "She and Kyle had a great time last night and said it was the best party yet." "About that, I think we should talk about some of the things that happened last night, especially your behavior," I said. Usually Amy is easygoing and it takes a lot to make her mad, but my comment hit a nerve. She snapped back, saying it was all innocent fun, that no one else was upset, and nothing serious had happened. I tried to stay calm and explain my feelings, but she wasn't having it. After venting, she gave me the silent treatment. As I started my yard work, I mulled over my feelings. I really didn't think I was being unreasonable. I wanted to let her be herself. That's the woman I fell in love with. But anything intimate should be just for us, including who sees her body. I'll admit I felt a bit insecure. Amy is a stunning, attractive woman, and I'm just a relatively plain-looking financial planner. Sure, I'm in good shape, but I know she gets hit on by all kinds of guys constantly. I didn't have any real reason to doubt her faithfulness, but there were a couple of instances before we were married that had triggered my concerns. We had been dating for nearly 3 months at this point and had been intimate almost the entire time. I felt close to Amy, and we had some good conversations about her life. She told me about how her father had left when she was young, leaving her mother to raise her and an older sister. Amy craved male attention, and once she started developing, she got plenty of it. I didn't want to dig too deeply into her past, but I gathered that her innocence was lost by age 16. She seemed to have had boyfriends and casual flings throughout her teenage years. Unsurprisingly, she never had to look far to find the next one. She loved attention and knew her looks could get it for her. We were invited to a party hosted by a casual acquaintance the following Saturday night. At this point, we hadn't formally agreed on exclusivity, but in my mind, we were exclusive. Amy had said she loved me, and to me, love and commitment went hand in hand. It was December, and the party was a bit dressier than usual. When I saw what Amy was wearing, my eyes nearly popped out of my head. It was a red dress that barely covered her chest. "You like my dress?" she teased. "Amy, you look amazing, but wow, that's pretty revealing," I replied. "You know I might run into some clients there, and, well, it's a bit much." Now, Amy doesn't often get mad, but when she does, it's almost always about her appearance. She got upset, saying I thought she looked trashy and that I was worried she'd embarrass me, among other things. It took a while, but I apologized, even though things were a bit frosty. We went to the party, and she wore the dress. The house was large and situated in the hills, beautifully decorated, with plenty to eat and drink. Some of my work colleagues were there, along with people I knew from college and others from the athletic club I belonged to. One guy at the party I remembered from college, something McAllister, was one of those arrogant, good-looking types, always confident with a smarmy smile and slicked-back black hair. He was making his rounds with that cocky grin and a glass of champagne in hand when he noticed Amy. She was getting a lot of attention, mostly from men, and most of it was directed at her cleavage. She stayed close to me, and suddenly I became popular with colleagues and casual acquaintances alike. At one point, I went to grab us a drink. When I returned, McAllister was chatting with Amy. He acted like we were old friends, and Amy was eating it up. All the attention, and now this good-looking guy was hanging on her every word like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever heard. I managed to steer her away from him, but as parties go, we eventually drifted apart. I found myself talking to some work colleagues who were sharing useful business ideas. I suddenly realized that it had been well over an hour since I last saw Amy. Feeling a growing unease, I did a quick scan of the living room, then moved to the kitchen and the family room. Still no sign of her. I tried to stay calm, not wanting to draw attention, but I was determined to find her. I also noticed that McAllister had seemingly vanished as well. Stepping outside into the chilly evening air, I scanned the group of people gathered for a smoke, but Amy wasn't there. Just as I turned to head back inside, I caught the sound of her laughter drifting from down the street. My heart sank as I walked in that direction, and there she was, strolling alongside McAllister, their conversation clearly a pleasant one. "Oh, hey babe, Jim was just showing me his new BMW," she said with a casual smile, completely oblivious to my rising tension. "She's a handful," McAllister quipped with a smirk. "I mean the car," he added with a chuckle. I scrutinized Amy. Nothing was obviously wrong, but her appearance was slightly disheveled, and something about the way she looked at me made my stomach churn. I forced a tight smile, but inside, I was seething. As they walked closer, Amy slipped her arm around me, a gesture that felt more like a cover than affection. "I'm heading out now," I said, keeping my tone as steady as I could. "Just wanted to check if you needed a ride home." "Of course I do," she replied, a hint of confusion in her voice. "Why wouldn't I?" At that moment, McAllister patted me on the back. "Good to see you again, man," he said, extending his hand. "Now, I'm no weightlifter, but I keep myself in good shape, and I've got a decent grip." Fueled by a mix of anger and suspicion, I shook his hand with more force than necessary. His confident grin faltered as he realized I was crushing his hand. His knees buckled slightly and his smile turned into a grimace. "Honey, you're hurting him," Amy said, alarmed. "Oh, my bad," I muttered, releasing his hand and turning to walk to the car, not caring if Amy was following or not. By the time I got to the car and buckled in, she had hurried to catch up with me. This was the first time we'd had a serious fight. I liked her a lot, she was gorgeous, and the chemistry between us was undeniable. But deep down, I knew she thrived on attention from others, especially men, and it was starting to gnaw at me. We hadn't formally defined our relationship, but in my mind, seeing each other regularly and sharing intimate moments was as good as exclusive. Still, we hadn't had that explicit conversation. I dropped her off at her place, and she gave me a puzzled look when I told her I wasn't coming up that night. "Oh, come on up. Nothing happened with Jim. We were just messing around," she said, almost pleading. "Well, I guess I've had enough of that for one night." "I'll see you later," I said coldly, and drove off. She called and texted multiple times, but I ignored her. I threw myself into my work, deciding to head to the coast for the week a day earlier than usual. I called my mom to let her know I'd be arriving Saturday morning instead of Sunday night, and she was thrilled to have me around for the weekend. That week back in my hometown was productive. I had a string of successful client meetings, and I was making significant progress in both my coastal business and my growing city practice. Professionally, everything was falling into place. A week ago, I would have said my personal life was too, but now I wasn't so sure. Amy kept reaching out, her texts and calls persistent, though my replies were brief and infrequent. She asked when I'd be back, and I told her Friday night. I had barely unpacked when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Amy standing there in a raincoat, a small, neatly wrapped gift in her hands. "This is for you," she said softly, handing me the package. I unwrapped it to find an old-fashioned skeleton key inside. "You hold the key to my heart," she said, her voice full of emotion. I stared at her, torn between the hurt I felt and the love I still had for her. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, she unbelted her raincoat, revealing a figure that was almost impossible to resist, a vision straight out of a fantasy. My resolve crumbled instantly as desire took over. Afterward, lying together, I couldn't help but ask her about what happened with McAllister at the party. "I know I shouldn't have gone outside with him, but Jim was being so nice," she said, trying to explain. "And what exactly happened?" I pressed. "Nothing really. He tried to get a little handsy, but I've been dealing with guys like that since I was a teenager," she replied with a shrug. We talked it through, and I confessed that I could get jealous. I told her that if she wasn't ready for a committed relationship, I'd be disappointed, but I'd understand. I made it clear that I don't do halfway. I'm either casually dating or fully committed. I emphasized that what we had wasn't just casual. She rolled over on top of me, looking directly into my eyes. "I'm committed too. I love you, and I want to be with you forever," she whispered, before making love to me again. Amy doesn't hold on to grudges, so after that intense truth or dare party, things seemed to return to normal. She was still the same affectionate, vibrant woman I had fallen for, but I noticed she was more attentive now, and there was less interaction with Sarah when I was around. One Saturday, while I was working in the yard, Mark passed by, which wasn't unusual since he lived close by. We got to talking about lawns and gardening, eventually moving to the back deck with a couple of beers. Although Mark and I hadn't been particularly close, he often came across as arrogant. We ended up having a good, long conversation. He opened up about his ongoing custody battle, revealing a side of him I hadn't seen before. It made me reconsider my previous judgments about him. Out of nowhere, Mark asked, "Where's Amy?" "She's out shopping," I replied, and we continued our conversation. About 15 minutes later, Amy emerged from the house in a tiny bikini and slipped behind the privacy screen, giving Mark a quick hello as she passed. Mark, of course, couldn't resist sneaking a look. I quickly wrapped up our chat and walked him to the gate. As he left, he jokingly asked if Amy needed help with suntan lotion, making me think back to the situation with McAllister. Despite everything, our relationship seemed to strengthen after that. I had forgiven Amy for her earlier behavior, rationalizing that we hadn't been fully committed at the time. Now, we were. Amy was affectionate, playful, and as adventurous as ever in the bedroom. She was stunningly beautiful, and I took pride in being seen with her in public. As the weeks went by, Amy began to drop hints about our future together. I had been thinking about the future too, but my feelings were conflicted. On one hand, I wondered if Amy was truly the right person for me in the long run. On the other, I couldn't deny that she was the embodiment of every man's fantasy. Eventually, I made up my mind. No one else could compare to Amy. I proposed to her, surprising her with a trip to the Caribbean to celebrate. She was ecstatic, immediately calling her mom and Sarah to share the news. When I told my parents, they were happy for me, though my dad's voice carried a hint of hesitation. The resort was nothing short of spectacular, with pools, bars, restaurants, and a secluded private beach. On our first day, Amy wore a revealing bikini that drew plenty of attention. We sipped drinks by the water, took a leisurely stroll on the beach, and later enjoyed a casual meal. Slightly tipsy, we returned to our balcony to watch the sunset, where things quickly turned intimate. The entire setting was incredible. The resort staff were attentive, always on hand to offer towels, directions, or anything else we needed. The Beach Boys, young guys in their early 20s, were especially eager to cater to the guests lounging by the water, mostly older women who enjoyed the attention. They'd bring drinks, adjust chairs, and even apply sunscreen if asked. Naturally, Amy, with her skimpy bikinis, caught their eye. Cruz, one of the Beach Boys, stood out. He was lean, tan, and had a bright smile. He always seemed to be nearby. One day I suggested we go jet skiing, but Amy wanted to work on her tan. So I arranged an hour-long session on my own. After a thrilling ride on the ocean, I returned to find Cruz massaging sunscreen onto Amy's bare back. It looked like his hands were wandering more than they should. "What's going on here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Cruz quickly jumped to his feet. "I didn't want Miss Amy to get sunburned, so I was just applying sunscreen," he stammered. "I'll take it from here," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. Cruz nodded and hurried away. "Amy, what was that all about?" I asked quietly, not wanting to cause a scene but needing an explanation. "What do you mean?" she replied, seemingly oblivious. "Your top was undone and that guy had free access to your body. Was he feeling you up?" "Oh, relax," she said dismissively. "He might have touched the sides a bit, but my body is only for you." I pushed the incident with Cruz to the back of my mind and focused on enjoying the rest of our time together. Shortly after, I suggested we take a nap, though we both knew I meant more than just sleeping. I had to carry a towel to cover my excitement as we walked back to our room. Eventually, our vacation came to an end and we started discussing wedding plans on the flight home. While Amy dozed off, I reflected on how amazing the trip had been, though I couldn't entirely shake the memory of Cruz and his hands on her. Back home, life returned to normal. Work was busy and fulfilling, and I was steadily building a solid financial foundation. Amy still worked at Lucero's, mostly during lunch shifts, which allowed us to spend our evenings together. She didn't need to work, but she liked having her own money. As summer approached, Amy and Sarah began planning the next couples gathering. After the Truth or Dare party, I had hoped these get-togethers would fade out, but they decided the next one would be at Mark and Jill's place in mid-July, a pool party. When I heard about it, I immediately told Amy, "None of the bikinis from the Caribbean." "How about the red one?" she suggested with a playful grin. "No way," I insisted. "Strangers seeing you like that is one thing, but not our friends." She didn't argue, and I thought the issue was settled. However, on the Tuesday before the party, I got a call from my mom. My dad had suffered a heart attack and needed bypass surgery. I rushed home, with Amy by my side, her hand on mine, trying to calm me as we drove to the hospital. My mind was racing, worried about my dad and how my mom would cope without his steady presence. When we arrived, we learned that the surgery had been successful and that Dad was expected to make a full recovery. I stayed with him that night while Amy and my mom went home to rest. The next day, Dad was in good spirits, working on a crossword puzzle. We spent the day at the hospital, but it was uneventful. I could tell Amy was bored, so I suggested she head back home. She hesitated, but eventually agreed to leave that afternoon. Thursday was spent helping my parents get settled. I watched baseball with Dad, who admitted it was boring but necessary. On Friday, I called Amy. She asked when I'd be home, and I told her not until Sunday at the earliest. She reminded me about the party, which I had completely forgotten. I apologized and asked if she still planned to go. She wasn't sure, but mentioned that Sarah and Jill's sister were pressuring her to attend. Saturday arrived and Dad seemed exhausted. I suggested he rest while I helped Mom around the house. I spent hours setting up storage racks in the basement until Mom called me for dinner. We ate together, but Dad was already asleep by the time I sat down. He needs the rest, I nodded in agreement. After dinner, I went back to organizing the storage shelves, losing track of time until I realized it was nearly 10 p.m. I need to call Amy, I muttered, dialing her number. Hey, what's going on? I asked when she answered. There was noise in the background. Hi, honey. I'm at Mark and Jill's place. We're having a blast, she replied, sounding distracted. That's right. The party is tonight, I remembered. How's Dad? She asked. There was a pause. Then I heard a high-pitched scream followed by laughter. What's going on? I asked, my concern growing. What, honey? She laughed again, clearly enjoying herself. How much have you had to drink? I asked, feeling uneasy. The connection isn't great, she said, her voice cutting in and out. Can I call you back? I'll call you back, I said, frustration creeping into my voice. But before I could hang up, the line stayed open. Suddenly I heard Mark's voice, clear as day. Take that top off too, followed by more laughter. I thought I heard Amy's voice, but it was unclear. Then the call disconnected. It was obvious they weren't just playing innocent games. What the hell is going on? I wondered aloud, too exhausted to drive back home, but desperately needing answers. I decided I needed to know the truth, so I called Henry Anderson, an old neighbor who lived nearby. Hey, Henry, can you do me a favor? I need you to take some photos of what's happening at Mark and Jill's place. I have to know what's going on, I said, my voice tense. On it, Henry replied without hesitation. I gave him directions explaining where he could position himself to get a clear view of their backyard. Thanks, man, I said, feeling a bit of relief knowing I'd soon have some answers. After finishing up the work I was doing, I turned off my phone and went to bed, too exhausted to dwell on my suspicions. The next morning, I woke up to find several messages from Henry, each one containing photos. As I opened them, my worst fears were confirmed, and then some. The images were worse than anything I could have imagined. The first photo showed Amy completely unclothed with Mark. The second captured Carl, also unclothed, grabbing Amy. The third showed Amy and Sarah both naked, dancing provocatively for Mark and Carl. The fourth and final photo was the most damning. Mark and Amy engaged in an intimate act. This is undeniable proof, I muttered to myself as I scrolled through the photos, feeling a cold numbness wash over me. Amy had betrayed me, and now I needed to figure out how to protect myself, my assets, my dignity, and get back at Mark and Carl for what they'd done. Around noon, Amy called, sounding as affectionate as ever. I miss you. How's your dad? When are you coming home? I really need you, she said sweetly. I almost confronted her right then, but something stopped me. Instead, I decided I would get even. I just needed to plan it out carefully. Dad's taking a turn for the worse, I lied. I need to stay here for another week. Oh, no. Do you want me to come up there? She asked, her voice filled with concern. No, it's best if you don't. Dad can't handle the excitement right now, I replied, trying to sound calm. That Monday night, I left for the city and called my old college roommate, Julian, to see if I could crash at his place for a few days. Sure, JT, he said, surprised but willing to help. When I arrived, he mentioned his brother was visiting from New York. Evan's thinking about switching careers, Julian explained. Interesting, I replied, not really focusing on the small talk. I needed to unload what had happened, so I told Julian everything and showed him the photos. Julian was shocked. I knew Amy was flirty, but I never thought she'd actually cheat, he said, shaking his head. I want to get back at Amy and the whole group, I admitted, but I need to keep this under wraps until I have a solid plan. Julian nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. I won't say a word. The next day, I staked out Carl's building, waiting for him to head to his truck. When I saw him, I waved him over. Carl, let's grab a beer, I suggested. He seemed surprised but agreed. We found a quiet tavern with few patrons, and after ordering drinks, I got straight to the point. What really happened Saturday night? I asked, my tone casual but probing. Carl shrugged. Just another typical party. This is typical? I asked, pulling up one of Henry's photos on my phone and sliding it across the table. Carl's eyes widened, but he tried to play it cool. Hey man, the girls took their clothes off. It didn't mean anything, he said, attempting to downplay the situation. Okay, no big deal, I replied, leaning in closer. But what do you think your boss would say about this? Carl froze, knowing his boss was a devoutly religious man and that he was desperate for a promotion. He started to stand up, but I shoved him back into his seat. Sit down and shut up, I ordered, my voice low but firm. I have questions, and unless you want your boss to see these photos, you're going to answer them. Carl looked desperate, his bravado crumbling. Okay, he agreed, defeated. We sat there for over an hour as he spilled everything about Amy. Amy and Sarah were in the less wealthy crowd in high school, he explained. The richer kids teased them about their old clothes and beat-up cars, but they knew their looks gave them an edge. Amy was beautiful, and Sarah's assets made her popular too. Carl continued, his tone a mix of resignation and bitterness. By 15, they both had boyfriends and probably lost their innocence around that time. I clenched my fists under the table but stayed silent, letting him talk. Later in high school, after a string of short relationships, Sarah told me about a conversation she had with Amy. Amy said, "All I want are nice clothes, a nice car, and a nice house. I like sex, so I don't mind trading it for those things. I'll find a man who can give me that. The wealthier, the better." My stomach churned as Carl recounted the story. So, she's always been like this? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Yeah, Carl nodded. When you two started dating, she had a boyfriend. She told Sarah she thought you had better prospects, so she dated you while still seeing the other guy for about 3 months. I felt a surge of anger. So she was with both of us at the same time? I asked, my voice rising. Yeah, Carl said, sipping his beer as if this was just another casual conversation. And since you've been married, I know of at least 2 other guys she's been with. I nearly choked on my drink. Who? I demanded. Carl shrugged. I don't know all the details, but one was a guy named Malum or something. She said you knew him. My mind immediately flashed to McAllister, the guy we met at that party before we got married. I sat there fuming while Carl casually drank his beer, seemingly unfazed by the bombshell he had just dropped on me. So if someone wealthier with a nicer car and house came along, Amy would leave me? I asked, already knowing the answer. Yeah, she would, Carl confirmed without hesitation. I sat in silence, processing everything. Finally, I asked, what happened on Saturday? Was Jill involved? Carl shook his head. No, Jill left early because her sister's boyfriend got into a fight. That's when the rest of the group. Well, that's when things got started. Jill doesn't know what happened. Hearing that Jill wasn't involved was a small relief. No, and don't let her find out, Carl insisted, his voice firm. I nodded, then asked, does it bother you that Sally's seeing other guys? Carl snorted. Wife, we're not even married. Sally calls me her husband, but we've never gone through with it. I care about her, sure, but marriage? Not with her. That's why we don't have kids. It was time to leave. My mind was swirling with thoughts. Amy wasn't just promiscuous. She was with me for financial security and would ditch me in a heartbeat if someone better came along. Only Carl knew the truth, and for now, that's how it would stay. Despite his laid-back demeanor, Carl clearly understood women better than I ever had. Back at Julian's place, I unloaded everything Carl had shared with me. Sadness turned to anger. and a deep sense of humiliation settled in. How many people had been laughing at me behind my back? Julian asked a few questions, then plugged in his headphones and started working on his laptop. I sat there drinking, my anger growing with each sip. After a while, Julian unplugged and looked at me with a cunning smile. "Has she ever met John Paul?" "No," I replied, confused. "I haven't seen him since college. Why?" Julian just shook his head, not answering directly. A few minutes later, he looked up again, his smile even wider. "Can you get your hands on $30,000 quickly?" "I can, but what for?" I asked, intrigued but wary. "And I need you to lease a BMW for 6 months," he added, still typing rapidly. "Why? What's the plan here?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. Julian leaned back in his chair, looking pleased with himself. "I've got a plan. It's going to cost you $30,000 and a BMW lease, but trust me, it'll be worth it." I listened closely as Julian laid out his scheme. "Go home to Amy tomorrow and act like nothing's changed. Then come back here on Thursday after work. John Paul will be in town by then, and we'll put the plan into motion." I called Amy and told her I'd be home that night. I did my best to act normal, blaming any strange behavior on stress from my dad's situation. Either I was better at pretending than I realized, or Amy was too distracted to notice. Thursday night, I met up with Julian and John Paul at Julian's condo. After some catching up, we got down to business. John Paul, with his easy charm and good looks, was perfect for the job. The plan was for him to pose as a wealthy New York investment banker and seduce Amy. He had 5 months before his next project started, so the timeline was tight. John Paul looked me in the eye, his tone serious. "Are you really okay with this? I mean, she is your wife." I stared back at him, feeling strangely detached. "I don't care," I replied coldly. After all, she'd probably be in bed with him within days anyway. With that, we began ironing out the details. I gave them Amy's schedule and stressed the importance of secrecy. The week went by without incident. I kept a close eye on Amy, but she acted the same as always. We still slept together, but it felt routine, mechanical even. Thursday came around again, and I was eager to hear how things were progressing. I was torn between wanting Amy to fall for John Paul and hoping she wouldn't. John Paul started with a smirk. "I've been to Lucero's 3 times now. The first time I made sure she noticed me. The second time we had some light conversation. By the third visit we exchanged names. She mentioned she works from 11 to 3. Tomorrow I'll show up around 2 for a late lunch and coffee," he continued. "I even bought a $1,200 suit to fit the part." The next week felt like a blur, though my thoughts kept returning to what might be happening between Amy and John Paul. One afternoon I noticed Amy came home later than usual. My mind raced, wondering if it had anything to do with him. It felt like I was on edge, waiting for the next twist in a suspenseful story. Thursday night came, and John Paul provided his update. We had coffee on Friday. Amy brought up that she's married, but she hinted at having problems, making it clear she's open to something new. We set up a lunch date for Tuesday. He then explained how he subtly hinted at his supposed wealth, revealing just enough to pique her interest. Meanwhile, I began to notice a shift in Amy. She was growing distant, which confirmed that the plan was working. On the day of their lunch date, I got home after 5, but Amy wasn't there. After a run, I returned, and she still hadn't arrived. As I was preparing dinner, she finally walked in. "Hey, how was your day?" I asked, masking my curiosity. "Oh, I ended up working late," she replied, trying to sound nonchalant. I knew she hadn't been at work, but I let it slide. We were drifting apart, and I allowed it to happen. The intimacy between us continued, but it felt more like a physical release than anything emotional. I made things easier for her. "Dad needs some help," I said. "I'm leaving Friday afternoon and might be gone for a while." "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked, though her offer lacked sincerity. "No, it's fine," I replied. "I'm just helping out and staying through next week to meet with some clients." Thursday night, John Paul gave me another update. Our lunch date turned into more than just talking. We ended up kissing. "She mentioned you'd be out of town, so we've made plans for Friday night," he said with a grin. "She's definitely interested." I felt a swirl of emotions, anger, betrayal, and a strange satisfaction that everything was falling into place. It was like pulling the strings and watching my plan unfold, but part of me still couldn't believe this was actually happening. As the weeks passed, Amy and John Paul's relationship deepened, as expected. By the weekend, I was certain they had slept together. I stayed at my parents' house, keeping myself out of the way while she was with him. It was no surprise when Amy began to emotionally distance herself from me. It was bittersweet but necessary. Occasionally I caught glimpses of the woman I once loved, which brought a pang of sadness, but those moments were fleeting. After about 3 months, John Paul began to express his love for Amy, pushing her for a commitment. By then, she was fully convinced he was a wealthy New York investment banker with a luxurious Manhattan apartment. "When she talks about you, it's like she's already moved on," John Paul reported one evening. "She said the relationship is over, but hasn't had that conversation with you yet." A few weeks later, Amy casually asked, "Sarah and I are planning a spa weekend in California. Is that okay?" I knew that John Paul had invited Amy to Sun Valley for the weekend, but I pretended to be clueless. "Sure, have fun," I said, masking my anger. That night, she was unusually affectionate, almost as if she were trying to make up for something. The irony was rich. She had no idea she was the one being played. John Paul had planned everything down to the last detail, including a proposal with a $500 cubic zirconium ring that looked like the real deal. Amy wouldn't suspect a thing. At our Thursday meeting, John Paul was all smiles. "She accepted the proposal," he said, showing me a photo of Amy grinning from ear to ear, flashing the ring. "She said she'll talk to you about leaving this week." This was the moment I had been carefully crafting for months. My plan was simple: act devastated, resist her decision, and drag out the process just long enough to make her desperate for a quick exit. That way she'd agree to my terms, ensuring my assets stayed protected. When Amy finally worked up the nerve to approach me, I could see the hesitation in her eyes. "JD, we need to talk," she began, her voice trembling. I looked up, feigning ignorance. "What's wrong?" She took a deep breath. "I think it's time for us to separate. I've met someone else, and I want to be with him." I acted stunned, letting my voice crack. "What? We're married, Amy. How can you do this?" She avoided my eyes. "I'm sorry, JD, but it's over. I need to move on." I shifted from shock to anger, raising my voice. "I won't let you go! We need counseling to fix this." She was taken aback by my reaction, but I could tell she was eager to end things quickly, exactly what I was counting on. A few days later, she came home with a document and placed it on the table between us. "This is what I'm proposing," she said softly. "I'll give up any claim to your assets, our house, your car, everything. All I want is an immediate divorce." I put on the best performance of my life, pretending to be utterly shattered. "I can't believe you're doing this," I whispered, my eyes welling up with fake tears. "But if this is really what you want." I signed the papers with a shaky hand, making sure to keep up the act until the very end. As she took the documents and left, I noticed the bounce in her step. She thought she was walking into a new life with a wealthy man in New York, but she was actually walking straight into the final trap. It was mid-September, and our divorce was set to be finalized on October 5th. Amy had already forfeited any claim to my assets, believing she'd be moving to New York and married by the end of October. We met at Julian's that Thursday to finalize the details of the plan. John Paul would stay in the rented condo for the next 2 weeks, keeping up the illusion. On the Friday they were supposed to leave for New York, Amy would return to our house to pack her things. John Paul would tell her he'd meet her there with a moving truck, but of course, he'd never show. By the time she realized she'd been duped, John Paul would be long gone, and so would her dreams. John Paul told her his last name was Taylor, Julian explained, a wicked grin on his face. "She'll have a tough time tracking him down, and even if she does, it'll cost her. She'll be practically broke." John Paul nodded, a hint of guilt in his expression. "This is pretty brutal, man," he said to me. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" I met his eyes without hesitation. "It's not nearly as brutal as what she did to me," I replied coldly. John Paul sighed. "I get it. But still, I'll miss her. She was a lot of fun. Yeah, I'll miss that part too, I admitted, though the truth was I was more than ready to move on. In the following weeks, my interactions with Amy were polite but distant. I had to fake remorse a few times, but I never once suggested she reconsider staying with me. I didn't want to risk her changing her mind. On the Friday she was supposed to leave, I met her at the house as she packed up her things. Part of me considered trying to get one last round in bed, but I knew it was over. She was dressed to the nines, clearly thinking she was about to start an exciting new chapter in her life. "Need any help with packing?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "No, I'm good," she replied with a smile, eager to move on. By 12:30 p.m., she was already on the phone trying to reach John Paul. I watched as her expression shifted from confusion to frustration when the call didn't go through. "The number's been disconnected," she muttered, redialing. She turned to me, her face pale. "Can I use your phone?" "Sure," I said, handing it to her, watching as she tried again, only to get the same result. She called the luxury condo where John Paul had been staying, but they told her the condo had been paid through Saturday and was now available for rent again. Panic started to set in. "I'm going to drive back to the condo and see what's going on," she said, her voice shaky. "Can I leave my stuff here for now?" "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "Take your time." She left in a rush, and I didn't hear from her the rest of the weekend. I knew exactly what Amy was going through: confusion, panic, and then the cold, hard realization that she had been utterly deceived. While she was grappling with that, I moved on to phase 2 of my plan. I carefully prepared 3 packets, each containing incriminating photos from the scandalous party she had attended while I was with my dad. In these photos, Mark, Sarah, Carl, and Amy were all clearly recognizable, fully exposed in every sense. The first packet went to Carl's ultra-conservative boss, accompanied by a note that read, "A man's work reflects his moral character, don't you think?" The second packet was sent to Mark's ex-wife with a note that said, "Just thought you'd like to know what your ex has been up to. Thankfully, the kids are with you." The third packet was delivered to Jill with a note saying, "Looks like we missed out on the fun. Sorry to bring this to your attention, but you deserve to know. How about we grab a drink when things settle down?" I signed each note with my name and phone number, leaving no doubt as to who had sent them. There was still one loose end: McAllister. I toyed with the idea of asking Julian to come up with a fitting surprise for him as well. Inevitably, Amy tried to crawl back. She showed up on Monday night, pretending everything was fine. "Hi, honey. Sorry about our little misunderstanding," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm home for good." I stared at her, my face a mask of cold detachment. "Amy, you destroyed my life," I said, my voice hard as steel. "This is not your home anymore. You were planning to run off to New York, remember?" "No, I've changed my mind," she pleaded, desperation seeping into her voice. "It's you I want, JD. You're the one I love." I was done playing games. "Forget it," I said bluntly. "Get out of here and don't come back." Desperation made her revert to her old tricks. She quickly stripped off her top, letting her bra fall to the floor, trying to use her body to sway me like she had so many times before. But I was beyond caring. As I slammed the door in her face, I couldn't resist adding, "Say hi to John Paul for me." I glanced out the window and saw her standing there, stunned, her bare chest exposed to the night air. Her expression was a mix of confusion and dawning horror as she tried to understand the significance of my words. I knew she was beginning to realize just how thoroughly she had been duped. As I watched, I noticed my neighbor, Henry Anderson, peeking over the fence, eyes wide as he got an eyeful of Amy. I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. The last I heard, Amy had moved in with Sarah. I'm sure she's already on the lookout for her next target, probably hoping for a guy who's as clueless as I used to be. Carl, on the other hand, got what was coming to him. Not only did he lose out on the promotion, but he was also fired. He left town in disgrace, abandoning Sarah in the process. Mark's fall was even harder. When he went to court for his custody hearing, the judge denied him more visitation rights, citing the incriminating photos I had sent as evidence of his unfitness. Then one Saturday night I received a frantic call from Jill. "Mark's on his way to your house," she said, her voice shaking. "He's drunk and has a gun. He knows you sent those photos." I quickly slipped out to the backyard, grabbing some blankets and pillows. I arranged them on the chaise lounge to resemble a body, leaving a dim light on to draw him in. I hid in the thick bushes on the other side of the yard, clutching a baseball bat. Even without Jill's warning, I would have heard him coming. Mark pounded on the front door, and when I didn't answer, he stumbled through the gate into the backyard. He spotted the setup on the lounge chair and crept over, gun in hand. He fired twice into the blankets, thinking he'd hit his mark. The first swing of the bat shattered his arm, sending the gun flying as he howled in pain. I swung again, aiming lower, ensuring he wouldn't be a threat to anyone ever again. Afterward, I called the police. With a gun fired and evidence of self-defense, the investigation was swift. Mark was arrested and charged with attempted murder. Later, I called Jill to thank her for the warning. "You're welcome," she said, her voice still trembling. "Now, about that drink you mentioned.